I'm fairly new to RPGs, and especially JRPGs. It's a tough genre to crack with all its multiple decade spanning series and dozens of very long classics to beat. Like, it took a while for me to become entangled and experienced with single player FPS games, but since most of the games in that genre are about 10 hours long, give or take, it isn't a dreadful task if you're looking at it in the long run. In a few years, you can get acquainted with several classics and newer titles alike. Now, I only discovered my love for JRPGs in the latter half of 2020, which made me immediately desperate to catch up. I know it's not necessary to play all of them, or even any at all, for me to enjoy other games in the genre, but they're so alluring that I just can't. Most older JRPGs have either aged pretty well or received good remakes slash remasters over the years that make them a blast to play, even today. It's much easier to play Dragon Quest I nowadays than it is the first Ultima or Ninja Gaiden. The turn-based combat can be scary at first, or at least was for me, a self-proclaimed dogshit strategist, but it's actually simple and intuitive in the myriad of early titles. Since I felt inexperienced with the genre, I became wary of writing about all those kinds of games for a long time since I usually like to focus on history and deep diving into mechanics. But I finally managed to let go of that style so that I can focus on talking about them more holistically. So yeah, this is me setting up a whole series of videos talking about my feelings and stuff with the JRPGs I've been playing. Let's begin. I once had no plans of even playing Final Fantasy VII. As much of a classic as it is, it's plagued by a bad PC port and some PlayStation 1 quirks that I usually like to avoid. That and the setting didn't interest me at first glance, though that was because I had only seen the city of Midgar before buying the game. But, against all odds and common sense, I bought the game in 2020 after loving my time with the 3D remake of Final Fantasy III. I know it sounds random to jump from 3 to 7 like this, but the other games were either more expensive or those weird mobile ports of the time, so I went with the 7th game, played it immediately, hated the keyboard controls, and moved on to something else. This set the tone for the rest of my experience with the game. I finished it over the stretch of more than a year, playing on and off and using the same save throughout. For the record, I never did this before with any other game. I'm the type of player that binges his entire 20-hour games in a few days, so why did I spread out my playtime so much with Final Fantasy VII? Also, was this good or bad for my experience? Okay, from now on, I'm gonna try to do this without being as anecdotal as I've been until this point. Final Fantasy VII may be a game that's been talked about ad nauseum, but the 1997 classic is so huge in scope and sheer size that I believe there will always be something new to take out of the experience by the people playing it. The closest medium that can be associated with this game isn't cinema, but literature. The events of the Midgar opening could be a whole game in and of themselves, something which publisher Square Enix took note of to make the remake. And many other sections like the Gold Saucer and the arcs that surround it are another example of that. One of the things that make RPGs special is how indulgent they can get. There's no discernible reason why Square needed to make Final Fantasy VII this long. They could have saved so much budget and production costs by cutting enough stuff to at least lose one of the free CDs the game needed to come with in the release. But they didn't. The multiple towns you can visit offer a ton of moving NPCs and detailed, unique interiors you can check out. No detail gets spared. No expense was spared. Final Fantasy VII is a work of pure ambition. Now, what does that mean for the players? Well, to start off, it makes the game very intimidating for JRPGs newbies. Sure, a lot of people that weren't familiar with the genre played it on a PS1 and loved it, but there are also a lot of people who are younger and can't get into it because of the random encounters or funny block people. And we can't and shouldn't change the game because of that. Still, I believe more people would enjoy something like Final Fantasy VII than it seems at first glance. Just for the Midgar intro alone, it's worth taking a look into the game. Towns are some of the most distinctive aspects of the JRPG genre, but Midgar blows every previous expectation out the window. It's a whole, complex place full of culture and quirks, and it makes for a bizarre playing experience. Why? Well, it's very linear for one. You can go out and explore a bit, but you can never leave town until you complete the whole thing there. There are older linear JRPGs, but none of them take as long to get you out of the first town as Final Fantasy VII. Most of the time you spend there serves to make you care about the protagonists, their cause, and the citizens of Midgar, all at once. Again, they could cut the notorious wall market section and you would still understand the story, but the fact that they care to make you actually spend time with your party members in a mostly stress-free environment is one of the main things that make Final Fantasy VII stand out. It's a game that chooses story over convenience most often, and that is also what makes it somewhat painful to play sometimes. A shining example of that is when your materia gets all fucked up and unorganized when you do Yuffie's side quest. You know, the one where she steals all your materia and only gives it back after you complete the damn quest. I literally had to go back to a previous save file because of this in my playthrough. I was very underleveled to do that section and couldn't handle all the encounters. What's worse is that when she gives you your stuff back, it doesn't equip automatically. You have to do a lot of fiddling with menus to organize them the way you had them before. And yeah, that kind of thing happens a lot, especially when party members leave for extended periods of time. I blame the free character party for that because there are a lot of standby characters you never even bothered to buy new equipment or materia for, and when you're suddenly in a combat heavy section without the help of your best party members, it really hurts to press on. But even considering all my whining, the game had a good reason to fuck you over every once in a while. You see, the guys at Square were just probably experimenting with ways to make select story moments more impactful, and, as a consequence of that, you truly feel the loss of a party member when they're gone. Also, since the materia system incentivizes you to shape every character into whatever you want, you can lose out on whole builds when these party changes happen. That little part where Cloud is gone especially affected me because he was my tank, and so I was just getting whooped by any enemy that dealt decent damage. This conflates the gameplay with the story very well, I'm not gonna lie. The way in which I valued the characters became closely related to both their role in the plot and their role in my battle party. And now we stumbled into the combat of Final Fantasy VII, which I have a lot of complex feelings about. On one hand, ATB combat sucks, and on the other, the mana system and materias can make fights very volatile. First, let me explain my thing with the ATB thing. They introduced this shit on Final Fantasy IV where you had to play in semi-real time, which made the combat simultaneously slower and clunkier in my view. I swear most of my combat experience was me getting desperate to get my inputs through before the enemy gave me another whack in the face. Though that's because I played on the fastest setting because, well, I hate long battles. Yeah, it's kinda weird. I don't mind random encounters or long dungeons, but long battles kinda suck. Mostly because you're just waiting for long animations to happen without much thought. Putting the game at the fastest speed did annoy me from time to time, but I don't regret doing it because the hours it saved me in the long run. But again, there are some very enjoyable aspects found in the combat. Playing with materia may suck because of how long it takes to get through those crazy menus that did not change enough from other games to accommodate the new systems, but on actual battles, it becomes immediately satisfying to see your build work wonders on enemies. And the pacing does a lot of heavy lifting in that regard. It's insanely tight in how not tight it is. There are long stretches of time where you get little to no dialogue and just have to fight for hours. And the same goes for long story moments. The game just knows how to savor its own individual set pieces instead of plowing through them before going somewhere else for variety's sake. And it still feels like a varied game because of that. Since I took a long while to actually beat Final Fantasy VII, there were days that I would open the game just to get lost for an hour in that crazy Great Glacier section, and some other days where I'd get a whole lecture on Cloud and Sephiroth's backstory. It made me never know what the fuck I was going to do when I opened it, and that was a really special feeling to me. Of course, Final Fantasy VII still clings to both Final Fantasy and overall JRPG traditions quite a lot. Some of them fit the game in their own way and others not so much. For instance, the dungeons are great. They can be slightly confusing because of the crunch of the extremely low resolution and compressed backgrounds, but that's honestly what gets them the classic dungeon feel. That's because most of them have some extremely simple layouts, so the feeling of being lost lies in the weird way you have to navigate what are essentially PNGs with movement meshes on them. It can get weird, and that's pretty cool. The simple layouts also fit the game's vibe very well. You do spend quite a bit of time in the dungeons, but you're often fighting battles instead of exploring. The game really likes to use most out of every background, since it would be a waste for them to span big mazes as they did in some of the earlier entries, considering the limited space on each CD. Some dungeons convey that "I'm lost" feeling beautifully. Namely, the Temple of the Ancients start out with a crazy, ethereal looking maze that is on a single screen and is simpler to navigate than it seems, if you ignore the visual crunch that I mentioned earlier. Thinking about it now, most of the places in Final Fantasy VII aren't fantastical, since it's a cyberpunk game and all, and that makes places forgotten by time like the temple all the more interesting. Most have their gimmicks, but they're almost always more traditional than the sci-fi ones. Even populated, non-dungeon places like Wutai stood out for me in that regard. It's hidden away in a corner of the map and completely optional. It doesn't have all that many cyberpunk bells since it has a completely different culture, and especially because it was basically frozen in time by Shinra to be used as a tourist attraction, and as a consequence of that, it feels like a hollow place with some very lively people inhabiting it. And the fact that it's optional is also very strange because it's a whole damn complex town with a lot to do and a fun storyline attached to it, if you ignore the material stealing. But that's what makes it beautiful. You can just ignore it if you want. So just spending time there feels special. Apart from the towns, Final Fantasy VII also brings a very intensely loaded storyline that was incredibly difficult to completely follow as a newbie playing the game sparingly. You would think that would come as a courtesy of Tetsuya Nomura's involvement, and it's true that he was involved in making the story apart from his work in the character designs, but I can't fully blame him since most of what happens in the main plot is crazy, and he wasn't even the main writer. That would be Kazushige Nojima. Before I talk a bit about the plot, just know I'm not spoiling the game, okay? I know a lot of people know at least some of the twists and turns of this plot, but I want to make this as comprehensive as possible for the people who haven't played the game as well, and not spoiling the game is often the better route for that to work. So, okay, I had to watch a plot retrospective after finishing this game. I admit it, it was just too much. There are at least 3 separate times where Final Fantasy VII outright fools you. Like, lies to your face for the sake of some cool plot twists. Mind you, those are some pretty cool plot twists, but it doesn't mean that I found them any easier to parse during my playthrough. That, coupled with the complex relationships between most of the main cast, makes this an unorthodox and very interesting story, even if it hurts my head sometimes. The cake for that accomplishment goes to the nature of the players in the conflict, which involves Shinra, a company that has a monopoly on energy generation and is destroying the world, Avalanche, a bioterrorist group that wants to stop Shinra's attack on the environment, the Ancients, who I can't get into without spoiling a lot of stuff, the planet itself, and a bunch of deities/semi-deities, misfits, and others that work for themselves or in smaller groups. All of these guys make for an interesting shakeup of the usual Final Fantasy plot that involves both in-universe politics and fantasy fairs by adding in the whole planet's life force as a major player, along with a better connection of the 2 main themes that I just mentioned. You can almost argue that the story of Final Fantasy VII is non-linear because of how many flashbacks you get and how much stuff you get to understand only by playing the whole thing again, or watching a plot recap like I did. Every major event that messes with the story and gameplay at once is iconic because of how much attention these moments draw to themselves with their unconventional indulgence in regard to plot details and sometimes mini-games, and that's part of the mysterious magic of playing Final Fantasy VII. But there's still one little thing I'd like to add on to. The characters. Everyone talks about the characters, and it's no coincidence that Final Fantasy VII's fandom is still going strong after more than 2 decades at this point, and that the remake could reignite it ever more feverishly. I don't actually have that much to talk about them that hasn't already been explored thoroughly by other people, so I'll just have some fun with this section. Let's start with the main party. Cloud is beautiful. For most of the game, he's a little toast man, but he's beautiful. Both he and Sephiroth, mainly because of the CG cutscenes, feel like the first time that Yoshitaka Amano's portrayal of pretty boys actually clicked in-game. A true revolution in the medium, if I'm being honest. Cloud is a grumpy young guy who gets really serious when you talk about things that can affect his ego, but he can handle world-ending stakes much more maturely. Barrett shows the side of a fatherly figure to the party while also being closely tied to his environmentalist thinking due to his past mistakes. He's one of the most emotionally complicated characters in the game and always focuses on what's important to him. Red 13 is the closest we have to an anime protagonist on here. He's the classic determined and arrogant underdog that discovers newfound motivation and strength after getting in touch with his past. Honestly, I wish the game had given him more big moments aside from the Cosmo Canyon section. Sid definitely beats Cloud in a most grumpy guy competition, but he has that simple southern middle-aged dude vibe to him, where he uses his harshness to try to communicate his endearment, which makes for some pretty fun moments. Now, Kate Sith is a weird one. He's full of spoilers, so I won't really touch him. I'll just say that I like that he's a cat. Similarly, I would talk about Vincent now, but I did not find him in a game. I'm sorry. I dipped when I found the secret boss you need to do to get to him, promised to myself that I would come back to get him, and ended up never returning. That's it for the main boys of the party, but of course, the girls are also great. The game never lets them get bogged down to simple tropes because of how much dialogue and agency they get. Apart from Yuffie, but she's basically comic relief. Let's start with Aerith. She's mysterious and determined, judging by how she straight up runs away from her home in the beginning. She's got that tough on the inside, soft on the outside thing that really messes with people. She's great. Tifa is one of my favorite characters. She keeps the group together and talks her shit whenever she needs to. Also, she's kinda the opposite of Aerith. She's soft on the inside, tough on the outside. As much as she starts very insecure, she eventually learns to accept herself without abandoning her older self. Now, Yuffie is awesome. Easily my favorite character. She falls on her face, punches the air, robs everyone for no fucking reason, and is an overall menace to society. She's extremely loyal while also being kind of a loner. I had to look up a guide to get her because you have to be very specific with your choices to convince her to join you, but she was worth every clickbait article I had to drudge through to get her. Yeah, I know this ended up being just me profiling all the members of the party in a completely arbitrary manner, but that's exactly what's so awesome about these characters. They get so much to do and say that every player ends up having a different experience with the little guys, which is a crazy achievement for a 1997 title. The story, gameplay, and not even the score would work nearly as well if the characters weren't this compelling. Of course, there are a lot of other cool people that are definitely not in the party, heroes and villains alike. Like, I love the Turks, Sephiroth, the other Avalanche guys, and everyone in between and outside that. That also extends to the town NPCs. It's just that I don't have funny stuff to say about them, I guess. Playing Final Fantasy VII can be a little draining because of the sheer density of content and occasional annoying fights, but it's such a delightful experience. It's easy to remember even some of the smaller moments, the music is goofy as fuck, and don't say that I'm lying because it is for the most part. The characters are fun as hell, exploration is uncanny and interesting, and the combat isn't as tiring as it seems, and can even be pretty fun sometimes. After all of this, I still can't say it's one of my favorites, but that's basically only because I don't vibe that much with the aesthetic and some of the framing, and I'm not gonna get into that because, in the end, it doesn't matter. In whichever way you cut it, Final Fantasy VII is bliss. I'm sure you already knew this, but I'm here to remind you that any dumbass like me can play it. So if you're iffy about starting to play it, give it a shot. It may even get you into the genre. Now, if you already played the game, I hope you had fun hearing my rambles.